Welcome once again to Questioning Christianity. I'm Dan McClellan, and sitting across the table from me is Rob Helton. We're glad that you joined us today. This is our third episode. And today we're going to tackle another one of those big questions. And the question today is there only one way to God, or is Jesus the only? How did we phrase that, Rob?
Let me see. Who says there's only one way to God?
I knew I had it close. That's the big question we want to get into. So thanks again for joining us. Rob, we've put our first two episodes up against a couple focus groups, and we've gotten some feedback. And one of the things that folks have said that they wanted is more friendly banter.
Oh, really?
Yeah, so now is the part of the show where we have to perform natural, friendly banter.
All right, let me get my notes out so that we can do that.
I've got a question for you.
Okay.
What did you do last weekend?
What did I do last weekend?
Yeah.
I don't know. I've slept since then. I can't remember. I honestly, what did I do last weekend? Well, it wasn't on the weekend, but one day last week we took our grandsons rafting.
Now that's exciting. How could you not think of that immediately?
Because it wasn't on the weekend.
Oh, okay.
I was trying to think of, one of the things I did on the weekend is I attended worship services here at First Baptist Church in Huntersville, North Carolina.
Well, that was great of you to do.
A little bit of a shameless plug there.
Yeah, well, we just so happen to be recording our podcast from First Baptist Church of Huntersville. So,
but I should interject that they take no responsibility for this.
That's right. They just allow us to use a table and the cool air conditioning. But we do want to give a special thanks to the Reverend Kyle Murphy for helping make this possible. Thank you, Reverend. Let's see. We're supposed to continue bantering for a little bit longer. Do you have any pets?
I do.
Yeah.
I have a dog. Her name is Meg.
What kind of dog?
She's a mixed breed. She, I think, is part like Brittany Spaniel and part Irish Setter.
Okay.
Not Irish Setter. Golden Retriever.
Okay.
Sorry.
So how big a dog are we talking?
She's like that tall. Can you see that?
Yeah, that clears it up for us.
She's like 1.5 feet tall.
Okay. Well, we're in between dogs right now. So we're looking.
I heard that. I'm sorry.
Yeah, it's a bummer. I guess I friended a couple of these shelters on Facebook, so I get to see these pictures of these dogs who need to be rescued, and they're just the sweetest, saddest looking faces. And so my heart can only stay frozen for just a little while longer, and then I'll have to go get one.
Go get one, Dan.
All right. This week's question.
Who says there's only one way to God?
That's right. Who came up with that, Rob?
I don't know.
But I've heard that before.
Yes.
Well, I've heard the idea that, there are a lot of similarities, and this is true. There are a lot of similarities between, most of the major religions. Isn't it, I guess, a nice, happy thought to think that each of them ultimately leads to God?
Yeah, a lot of folks use the phrase, there are many paths to God, and so I think that's a question that definitely should be explored seriously. The passage in John chapter 14, where Jesus is having a conversation with his disciples, and then the process says to them, I am the way, the truth, and the life, and no one comes to the Father except through me. Now, that one statement has created an awful lot of controversy in the religious world because it seems to be offensive to people who do not follow Jesus for Christians to say that Jesus is the way to God.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's kind of an intolerant view to think of this being, I guess, an exclusive club. Mm-hmm. Based on your study of scriptures, what do you think Jesus was trying to say?
Well, what I don't think was in the mind of Jesus was, okay, I'm going to establish this movement called Christianity, and then only people with the label Christian will get to go to heaven. I don't believe that Jesus was trying to talk about some exclusive pathway to heaven. I believe that Jesus was talking simply out of his experience of who God is and who he was in relation to God and who he is in relation to God.
Jesus is spending his last hours with the disciples, and before he goes to the cross and before he leaves them, this is what he says. He says, "Do not let your hearts be troubled. Trust in God, trust also in me. In my Father's house are many rooms. If it were not so, I would have told you. I'm going there to prepare a place for you, and if I go and prepare a place for you, I will come back and take you to be with me, that you also may be where I am. You know the way to the place where I am going." Thomas said to him, "Lord, we don't know where you're going, so how can we know the way?" Jesus answered, "I am the way, and the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me. If you really knew me, you would know my Father as well. From now on, you do know him and have seen him." And Philip said, "Lord, show us the Father, and that'll be enough for us." Jesus answered, "Don't you know me, Philip? Even after I've been among you for such a long time, anyone who has seen me has seen the Father. How can you say, 'Show us the Father'?" Okay, so we're going to look specifically at this one verse, this key verse in the text that has to do with this really audacious claim that Jesus makes. It's in verse 6, if you want to take a look at it. Jesus answered, "I am the way and the truth and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me." This phrase, "comes to the Father." No one comes to the Father. What is Jesus talking about? Well, we need to understand the text in its proper historical context. And when Jesus begins this passage, if you look back at the beginning, when he first starts talking to his disciples, he says something that they're going to understand from their cultural perspective. And what Jesus is doing, he's picking up on the marriage ceremony in the Jewish tradition. This analogy that he uses, they're going to be familiar with. He's describing a marriage. And this is what he says in verse 2. "In my Father's house are many rooms. If it were not so, I would have told you. I am going there to prepare a place for you. And if I go and prepare a place for you, I will come back and take you to be with me, that you also may be where I am." Now, in the ancient world, in the Jewish tradition, a marriage was kind of a long, drawn-out process. A couple got engaged, and there was a ceremony for that. And then the man left. The man went away. The lady stayed in her father's house. But the man, the groom, went away to prepare a place for her. And he went back to his own father's house, and he would build an addition to his father's house. In that world, families actually built these little walled compounds. And the father was the patriarch. He was the one in charge. He was the head of the family. And the sons, when they married, would bring their brides back to that house, and they would build a little addition on it. And then they would come to the Father's house. And this is exactly what Jesus is describing. And so I say all of that to say this. What Jesus believed deeply was that for a person to go to heaven was for that person to come into the very presence of God. Have you thought about that much? We get this cartoonish idea of heaven being this place where we go and we float around on clouds, play harps. The whole point of heaven is that when you're in heaven, you're in the very presence of your Creator. This is what the writer John said when he wrote the book of Revelation. He said, "I heard a loud voice from the throne saying, 'Now the dwelling of God is with men. He will be with them. They will be his people. And God himself will be with them and be their God.'" You think John wants us to know something about what heaven's like? The idea here of people being with God is a scary, scary thought. How do you think these disciples from the Jewish tradition thought about this? They come from a tradition where you did not approach God. You were not in the presence with God. In fact, for a sinner to be in the presence of God was a very fearful thing. Maybe one way for us to think about this is, for instance, like a smoke-free restaurant. A smoke-free restaurant for a person who is not a smoker is a great place to be. The air is pure. It's clean. Everybody who is not a smoker loves to be in a smoke-free restaurant. Who is not happy with a smoke-free restaurant? A smoker. A smoke-free restaurant for a smoker is the most miserable place in the world to be. He can't wait to get out so that he can light up. So maybe we can think about it this way. Heaven is not the kind of place that a human being in our sinful condition would want to be. Does that make sense? So when Jesus says to them, you're going to be in the presence of God, it makes really good sense that they're going to need a way to be there.
You're listening to Questioning Christianity with Rob Helton and Dan McClellan, who says there's only one way to God.
Jesus believed that he had a special connection to his Father. He used the Aramaic term Abba, this kind of intimate term, we would probably say daddy. And he had special insight into who God is. And what we believe as followers of Jesus is that who God is was ultimately revealed in Jesus Christ. Now, another way to look at that, way to think about it, I guess, is to say, what would it be like to be in God's presence? I mean, here is this entity that is totally undiluted purity and righteousness, God, the Creator. Could we actually be comfortable in His presence, the presence of holiness? So it's not so much about how are we going to get a ticket to this place called heaven. That's not what Jesus was getting at, I don't believe. I think what Jesus was getting at is how do we become the kind of people who actually want to be in the presence of God? And so Jesus talks about how His way is the way to become the kind of people who want to be with God.
Well, I think we've already changed the conversation from how traditionally this has been presented, at least to me, is that when Jesus says, I'm the way and no man comes except through me, we immediately jump to this idea of getting into heaven. Mm-hmm. And so it sounds like you're saying that Jesus is the way to experience the presence of God now. Am I putting words in your mouth?
No, I think that's a fair statement. Yeah. There's a guy named Dallas Willard. He's written an awful lot of good stuff. The Divine Conspiracy is a really good book that Dallas Willard wrote, if you want to pick it up. But I think it's in The Divine Conspiracy that Willard says, I'm convinced that God will let anyone into heaven who can possibly stand it. It's not that God is somehow in this special place and He's cutting people off from going there who doesn't have the special ticket. We come to know Jesus, and by knowing Jesus and by trusting our lives to Jesus, following Jesus, we become less hellish people, or people whose lives would not be described as being hell. So consequently, when we come to know Jesus, when we entrust our lives to Jesus, when we follow Jesus, then we become the kind of people who are heavenly, whose lives would be described as heaven. That's not some kind of just, some kind of euphoric
hippie dribble,
state of mind, or having the perfect little family, the father knows best kind of family that doesn't ever have any problems. That's not it at all. But we become the kind of people who have learned to live through the power of Jesus in the moment-by-moment presence of God, and that can simply be described as heaven.
So let's think again about the verse. Let's read it out loud again. Jesus answered, I am the way and the truth and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me. So let's think about this phrase, the way, the truth, and the life. The way, the truth, and the life. When people talk about from whatever religion that they're coming from, whatever faith tradition, they talk about a way to heaven. It's like, yeah, we want to go there. Heaven is paradise. Heaven is where everybody wants to go. But here's the thing, guys. Until we're somehow changed, we don't want to go to heaven. We don't want to be there. Here's the idea. The idea is not that we need a way to get into heaven, but that we need a way to become the kind of people who actually want to go. What the Bible teaches is that people need to be transformed. We think about heaven kind of like the Willy Wonka chocolate factory. We believe we can just get a ticket in. You know, if we're lucky enough to be born in the right place and have the right parents, to hear the right gospel presentation, if we're just lucky enough to get our ticket in, that's what everybody wants. As soon as we get that ticket, then that's great. That's wonderful. You know, just to get a ticket in. If you've seen the play, I watched it, or the movie, I watched it with my grandsons a while back. All the kids that get into the chocolate factory are not the kind of kids who want to be there, are they? You see, the kids somehow needed to be changed in order to be comfortable in that place. What needs to happen is not that somehow we have to get a ticket to heaven. It's that we have to be changed. We have to be transformed to even want to be there. Brennan Manning tells a story about a group of people who go to the gates of heaven. They're the righteous people. They're the church members. They're the faithful people. They spend all their lives in church, and they know the Bible from one end to the other. And they're all gathered around the pearly gates, and they're just waiting on the gates to open. But then another group approaches, and they know these people. They're the down and outs. They're the drug dealers and the prostitutes in town, and they're the people who never go to church. And they came up. They all are standing at the gates of heaven, all of them together. And the gates open for everybody to go in. And the down and outers go in, the drug dealers and the people who don't deserve it. They walk right on in to the gates of heaven. And then the other people become so enraged because God would dare let those people go into heaven that they turn around and they walk away. The gates of heaven are open for all of us. The thing about it is we have to be changed to want to go in. Whether your God is religion or whatever it might be, you have to be transformed to want to be there.
Now, the question, Dan, that we haven't actually dealt with the question yet.
Okay.
The question is...
I figured we'd get to it.
Yeah. What about all these other pathways to God? Whether we call him God, whether we use the ancient Hebrew covenant name for God, Yahweh, whether we call him Allah, it doesn't matter what name we use. Jesus wasn't trying to launch a religion that would be exclusive of other religions. Jesus was trying to describe a way, his way, and because he knew who God was and what God was like, he knew that his way was the only way to come to know who that God is. So, does that mean then that a Muslim person who maybe believes differently than I do stands before God someday and God says, no, I'm not going to let you in because you never learned about Jesus and you didn't know who he was, and so I can't let you in? Well, first of all, I don't get to make that call. No human being does. If we say one person gets into heaven and another person doesn't, then that's what the Bible calls judging. We don't get to judge. Only God can do that. Secondly, I believe that God is opening his self up to anyone who will step into that. This is where things get a little bit exclusive. We simply believe that Jesus is the one who, through his life, through his teaching, has opened up the pathway of knowing who God is. Maybe this will help. I hope it does. I share this little story, and it could be an urban legend. No one knows for sure if it's absolutely true or not. It was told as a factual event to me. But the story goes that there was an elderly Jewish man who had been very successful in business and was invited to Washington to pray at a prayer breakfast. And so he accepted that invitation, and he went, and he was to pray at the prayer breakfast, and he was a very wise, elderly gentleman, and he exhibited that wisdom in the words of his prayer. He said, "God, I pray that all Jews would become followers of Jesus Christ." And then he prayed, "God, I pray that all Muslims would become followers of Jesus Christ." And then he said, "And God, I pray that all Christians would become followers of Jesus Christ." See, what this Jewish man knew was that there was something about this person, Jesus, that gave special insight into who God is. And that whether you call yourself Jew or Muslim, to know who God is, you need to know who Jesus is.
What is it about Jesus' life and teachings that speaks to you the most?
Well, at least at this part of my journey, it would have to be the teachings of Jesus about enemy love and nonviolence.
And why those two things?
Because they're unique to Jesus.
Mm-hmm.
Jesus came saying some things that no one had ever said before, which I believe, for me, is really strong evidence that Jesus was more than just a Jewish rabbi who lived 2,000 years ago. But Jesus taught that this merry-go-round of violence that the world is on is simply the way that the world is plunging itself into hell, and that the way out is not to ultimately kill off all your enemies. Because unfortunately, when you do that, there's nobody left because everybody's an enemy. Uh-huh. Jesus knew that ultimately the only thing that defeats hate is love. And the only thing that defeats violence is enemy love and refusing to be violent in the face of that.
I honestly believe that Christians sometimes bring an awful lot of antagonism on themselves. It is absolutely true that throughout the history of the church, many representatives of Christ have been arrogant and intolerant and mean-spirited. That's just the truth. In fact, in my short life, some of the most bigoted and hateful and hard to get along with people I've known have been Christians. So maybe we can say this. Some people who claim the name of Jesus Christ are just real jerks. It's just the truth. And if you've experienced that in your life, if somehow someone who claimed the name of Jesus Christ actually kept you from Jesus Christ, I want to stand before you today and tell you from the depths of my heart, I'm just as serious as I can be, I'm deeply sorry for that. I really am. And that is not who we're called to be. That is not how we represent Jesus Christ.
You're listening to Questioning Christianity with Rob Helton and Dan McClellan, and we're trying to tackle this big issue, or this question: who says there's only one way to God? Well, Jesus, I guess, said that. So that's who. So that certainly causes us to listen. What we've been trying to do is figure out exactly what he meant by that. And I think the conversation has, and I like this, the conversation is kind of focused on the here and now, about being in God's presence now, and how Jesus' life and teaching helps us better be in the presence of God now. But often this scripture is used in explaining what happens to us in the afterlife. So I kind of want to shift gears a little bit and touch on that. So if Jesus is showing us, and he's saying he's the one way to God, is he talking about here and now and also in the afterlife? Does he see those as one and the same? What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I don't believe that Jesus would think about a great barrier between this life and what we would call the afterlife. I believe that Jesus sees this multidimensional universe. And in fact, that's not really right either. We sometimes think about the universe is the big container and God is somewhere way far at one end of it. Or maybe God is present here, but that God is somehow within the universe. And I don't think that's right. I think the universe is within God. The Apostle Paul quoted a Greek philosopher one time, and he said, "In him we live and move and have our being." So somehow we are operating within the presence of God all the time. What Jesus was helping us understand is not how to get to a certain destination someday, but it's how do we know and live in the presence and commune with God now.
And that's how the disciples would have understood what, if they understood it, what he was saying.
I think so.
Yeah.
I don't think that the disciples would have thought about the afterlife the way that we do. Now, they look to what they called the end of the age, when all of the righteous would be resurrected. In fact, all people would be resurrected, and there would be a judgment, and the righteous would be resurrected to life. But I don't think that in that moment they would have been thinking about what heaven is the way that we tend to think about it.
So is it just a simplification or oversimplification of what Jesus is trying to say here, to try to narrow it down to just a message about getting to heaven? Or is it just wrong to think about it in those terms?
Well, I don't know that it's wrong to think about it in those terms. I think it includes that.
Yeah.
It's just limited to think about it in those terms. What we're doing as followers of Jesus is learning to live and commune with God. In fact, our Trinitarian confession is that God is Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. That when we come to know Jesus and learn from Jesus, then we are learning to live with God.
Let's think about this last phrase. Jesus said, "No one comes to the Father except through me." Now, notice that Jesus didn't say Christianity is the way, the truth, and the life. And no one comes unto the Father except through Christian doctrine or dogma. Jesus didn't say the sinner's prayer and baptism is the way, the truth, and the life. And no one comes unto the Father except through these rituals. Jesus said, I am the way. I am the one who can change you. I am the one who can transform you. Now, for 2,000 years, people have been transformed through their faith in Jesus Christ. For 2,000 years now, millions of people have experienced forgiveness, have pledged their allegiance to Jesus Christ, have been dramatically, mysteriously, miraculously transformed. People who used to be abusers have been transformed into loving people. People who used to be addicts have been transformed into victorious people. People who used to be selfish have been transformed into generous people. And millions have found that transformation by placing their faith and their trust in Jesus Christ. And so, is that, to some extent, is that exclusive? Yes, it is. Truth by its very nature is exclusive. And when we reach that point of disagreement with another faith tradition, we're not mean-spirited, we're not intolerant, we just respectfully disagree.
This is Questioning Christianity with Rob Helton and Dan McClellan. We're glad that you've joined us today, and hopefully something that we've said today has inspired or encouraged you. I mean, Rob, if we have to summarize this question here of who says there's only one way to God, what's the takeaway? Or is this one of those questions that just doesn't have a clear, simple answer?
Well, I guess let me try to do it in parts. I want to be really careful to say that what we're not saying, or at least what I'm not saying, is that people who call themselves Christians can exclude anyone else from, heaven, if we want to say it that way. We do not have the right. We are not permitted to look at another human being, whether that person is of another faith tradition or no faith tradition, and say, you will not get in, or even say, you cannot get in right now. Only God can do that.
Well, didn't Jesus deal with that a little bit? I mean, with the religious people of his time that were good at labeling the in and the out folks. I mean, he didn't have very kind words for folks like that. Wouldn't he say something kind of similar to us today?
Exactly. Yes, I believe that. That doesn't diminish what we profess when we talk about Jesus as the way. We truly believe that Jesus is the one who is revealing to humanity the heart of God. In fact, I believe that many people of other faiths would agree with that. And I think that there are people of other faiths who have in some way entrusted themselves to that. If we somehow make Jesus the exclusive property of people who go by the label Christian, then I don't know that we can do that. I think there are a lot of people who have the label Christian who haven't entrusted themselves to Jesus, who are not day by day following the ways of Jesus and entrusting themselves to Jesus. And I think that there are some people out there who go by the label Muslim who are day by day actually living out their faith in Jesus, maybe better than some Christians.
Thanks for listening to our podcast. This is Questioning Christianity with Rob Helton and Dan McClellan. And Rob, it's about time to wrap this thing up. Any final thoughts about this question of who says there's only one way to God?
I guess I would just say, if that idea offends you, if the text that we've been talking about and the words of Jesus are offensive to you, what I would do is, I guess, just invite you. I don't want to insult you. I think I understand where some of that comes from, because there has been a lot of destructive things happen in the world because of the exclusivity of religions. And I get that. But what I would ask you to do is, I would just invite you to step in to the life of Jesus. If nothing else, as an intellectual exercise, begin to explore the life of Jesus as a serious student, no matter what your faith is, or if you're not a person of faith at all. I believe it's just the intellectually responsible thing to do, actually. I mean, what American would go all of his life in a public school system or any school system and refuse to study anything about a guy named Abraham Lincoln? We just wouldn't do that. What responsible human being or resident of planet Earth would go all of their life and refuse to understand anything about the life of the most influential person who ever lived? So step into the life of Jesus, begin to explore his life, and I believe that when we do that, when you read the Sermon on the Mount, for instance, and you do it reflectively, and you think about the things this person said and the way this person lived his life, then I believe that experience will be life-changing for you. And so I would challenge you to that experience.
If you have questions or comments or want to follow up with us in any way, we encourage you to start at our Facebook page. It's facebook.com/questioningchristianity. And from there, you'll find a link to our blog and be able to subscribe to this podcast. Hopefully, you'll help us spread the word and share it with some of your friends. But we really would like to continue the conversation with you this week, and we'd love to hear from you. And if you have questions, we'll try to address them next week. Just had one follow-up question about last week's podcast. In the sermon last week, you said that God gives us free will because he's like a good parent. Is that a good way to think about God?
I think so. Of course, we have to remember that we have a limited understanding of what a good parent is.
Yeah.
that's why it's hard for us to attribute that ultimate good parent quality to God, because as a parent, I screw up a lot with being a parent. And so I just have to remember that God is a parent who doesn't screw up. But yeah, I think that's a good way to think of God.
All right. What's on tap for next week's episode? Let's see. I'm not good at remembering. I can only think about the show we're doing right now.
Yeah, me too.
Oh, here it is. All right. Haven't religious people been responsible for a lot of war and violence?
Exactly.
All right. So we'll see what we can get into that next week. Hopefully something that we've talked about today has encouraged and inspired you. This is a show for folks like you and I who just want to ask these questions and want to have these conversations. We don't always get definitive answers. And often we leave these conversations with more questions than we started with. But anyway, hopefully today something has kind of spoken to you, or at least given you something to think about in the week ahead. So for Rob Helton, I'm Dan McClellan. Thanks again for joining us, and we'll see you next time on Questioning Christianity.